Good evening. I'm Marilyn Cargill, Vice President for Financial Aid Services at VSAC, and I would like to welcome you to VSAC Shows You How. Tonight we are talking about appealing your financial aid awards. When is it possible and how do you do it? We'll be talking with two experts who will walk us through when you should appeal financial aid and what steps you need to take in order to appeal your financial aid package. Our experts are going to focus on three real life scenarios that many of you may be facing. And then through questions, you can raise other scenarios that are important to you. There are poll questions on the screen that we would like you to answer that will help our presenters understand who's in the audience tonight. One of the very best reasons to join a webinar is to ask questions of the experts. To raise questions from the Zoom platform, you can type the question into the Q&A section. If you are watching from the Facebook platform, just type your questions into the comments. We also plan to have time at the end of the presentation for any additional questions that you might have. Let's get started by meeting today's presenters. Miranda Roth works in the Grant and Scholarship Department for VSAC, where she's been helping Vermont families pay for college for over 22 years. Miranda is also the mom of a college student, so she has experience both professionally and personally in what many of you are going through right now. And Miranda is also an alum of St. Michael's, so she's very familiar with our great Vermont schools. Miranda will be the expert on how to appeal your Vermont state grant. Our second presenter tonight is Donna Stevens. Donna started as a financial aid counselor at UVM in 1984. She moved to VSAC, where she then spent 20 years as a grant counselor, a manager in our financial aid services division, as well as the manager of the VSAC Resource Center. In 2007, Donna accepted the director of financial aid at Champlain College. And then in 2010, she moved to the student services team at the University of Vermont as an assistant director of customer service for a total of 35 years in the financial aid profession. Donna and Miranda, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Absolutely.
And before we get started, can we see the results of the poll? Great, thank you so much. So let's get started. Donna, can you provide the big picture answer to what is a financial aid appeal?
Absolutely. So this evening, we're going to be discussing several different factors relating to the process for requesting need-based financial aid appeals. If you're experiencing any changes to your income or other allowable circumstances, which we'll touch on a little bit later, you may be able to request a review of those circumstances, which could result in a reevaluation or an increase to the financial aid that you have currently been offered.
Great, thank you. Miranda, why should someone appeal?
So you should appeal your financial aid if your financial situation has changed since you completed the financial aid applications for the year, or you feel the information provided on those financial aid applications does not accurately represent your current financial situation. So when you apply for financial aid, you complete a bunch of financial aid forms. You complete the FAFSA, the free application for federal student aid. You complete the Vermont grant application, and you might also complete financial aid applications for your college. And when you're completing those applications, they ask for a lot of information. They ask for your income information, and for the upcoming school year, that's from 2019. They ask for your family size information, and on the FAFSA, that is family members or people that you or your parents will provide more than half support to from July 1st of this year through June 30th of next year. And the asset information that you provide on the applications is usually as of the date that you're completing the application. So we know all of that information can change, and it could change often. So if it has changed and it is going to impact your ability to pay for college, you should appeal your financial aid.
Thank you, Miranda. So Donna, when is the right time to appeal? Are there time limits that families need to be aware of?
That's a great question, Marilyn. So basically, if you have applied for financial aid right now or in the process of applying for financial aid, for example, for the 21-22 school year, your 2019 income was required on the FAFSA. If you've experienced any changes to your family circumstances since you've completed the FAFSA, such as a loss of employment, reduction to wages, or other circumstances, again, that we will discuss, that could impact your eligibility to contribute towards your students' educational costs, you should notify your college, university, school, as well as your state agency regarding those circumstances as soon as you're aware of those changes. The student can apply for an appeal at any time during their aid year, during their award year for 21-22. But the sooner you're aware of what those circumstances are, or the sooner that you realize that you may need some additional assistance, or if you're trying to make a decision as to whether or not to attend a university, reach out to your college as soon as possible. And then we'll work with you. The colleges will work with you on those processes.
Great. So Miranda, at the highest level, recognizing we're going to talk specifics in a minute, how do students and families appeal their financial aid award?
How you appeal will vary from college to college and between the colleges and VSAC. But basically, high level, you will appeal your federal and your college financial aid through your college financial aid office. And you will appeal your Vermont grant eligibility through VSAC. And all of us will have different requirements on what can be appealed and what documentation you may need to provide to us, and we'll cover a little bit of that later. So the best place to start is just with a call or an email to us. Let us know your situation, and then we'll walk you through the process.
So it sounds like one really important tip for everyone to remember is that if you're appealing your financial aid, you appeal to each of the colleges that you've applied to, and you appeal to VSAC for your state grant. So it's a
Correct.
it's a process that has to go out to a lot of different groups, not just one. And one other thing I will add, this past year, as many of you know, COVID-19 hit a number of Vermont families really hard. And we had record numbers of appeals coming into the Vermont State Grant Program. On average, families that appealed their Vermont State Grant last year received an increase of award of about $2,000, which is very significant when it comes to paying for higher education. So as everyone has said so far tonight, as both Donna and Miranda have said to us, if your circumstances have changed, or if you believe the information that is on that application does not represent your ability to pay for college, you want to reach out to your schools as well as to VSAC. So what I'd like to do now is I'd like to present the two of you with examples of appeals and let you tell me how they'd be handled both at VSAC and at the schools level. And Donna, I know that you're going to try to represent both what UVM would do, but also in general, how schools would look at some of these things. So thank you for both your focus at your own institution, but your ability to give us that broader view.
Absolutely.
So in this particular case, Marcia and her husband, John, are self-employed and have owned a food cart since 2014, where they sell homemade sandwiches, chips, salads, beverages. They run their food cart in the spring, summer, and fall outdoors and at the indoor farmer markets in the winter. In 2019, they had a really great year and finally felt like they had turned a financial corner. This year, however, although they are both still working, they've seen their income fall. In large part due to COVID-19, they simply aren't seeing the foot traffic they are used to, and their income is much lower than it has been in years. Even though they are both working full time, can they still appeal?
Absolutely. The first thing that I want to mention is that anytime you think that there is something different going on in your circumstances, notify your schools immediately. Now, for some of you, you may be in the process right now of trying to make an admissions decision. So you're going to want to notify each of those schools as to what your circumstances are so that they can also determine what you might be eligible for under the form of an appeal. In this case, we have an income appeal. So the family's income is lower for 2020 than it was for 2019. The student's initial financial aid award will be based on that 2019 information that was put on the FAFSA, and a financial aid award will be determined from that. Once the family has contacted the schools and let them know, the schools know that their income has changed, there's been a reduction to their income, then they will be given the option and the advice as how to proceed. And basically, there will be a couple different options. If the family has already completed their 2020 tax return, they will be asked to provide a copy of their 2020 tax return along with their 2020 W-2 information. If the family has not completed their tax return, they will be able to, at many institutions, complete a 2020 estimated income worksheet and provide the supporting documentation that would go along with that. So they would need to provide their 2020 W-2s or their end of the year statements. The college will take all of that information and put that information into the new formula that represents the family's changes and send that information off to the federal processor. And when that information comes back, the college will then use that new revised information to redetermine the eligibility for the student's financial aid. UVM will do that as well. UVM will also give the student the option of, for the 21-22 school year, of using 2020 income, and in some instances, 2021 income. But I think the most important thing to stress through all of this is to reach out to the schools. We'll ask for the documentation that we need from you, the schools will, and UVM will, to make any revisions, if possible, to the student's financial aid award. And at that point in time, we will notify the student of any changes to the award. Now, the student could be considered for additional federal aid, institutional aid, again, depending on the school. So there are many different ways to potentially gain more funds going through this appeal process. It's also important that when you're filing an appeal, that the income that you're asking us to use is truly less than it was for the 2019 aid year. Because if the income isn't less, then there's a very good chance that, unless there's some other mitigating circumstances in there, there's a really good chance that they would not make any kind of a difference to you from a financial aid perspective.
So Donna, a quick question.
Sure.
If the family's income actually was higher than it had been in 2019, would it hurt them, or would you just not use the higher income and you'd continue to use the 2019?
Schools would continue to use the 2019 income, because that is the income that was required on that specific aid year's FAFSA for 21-22. So it will not hurt the family if we continue to use the 2019 income. The purpose of an appeal or using special circumstances is to try to do what's best for the family within the regulations.
Great, thank you. Miranda, what about at VSAC? What would happen to this family?
At VSAC, for the Vermont grant, we will ask the family to estimate their 2021 income. So we look for the family to estimate the income that they will have in the year that the student is going to school. So instead of 2019, we could use 2021. And we will post an estimated income worksheet for the family to complete. And they can complete it online. It's a pretty quick worksheet. Once we receive it, it's about 10 to 15 business days, and we would review that appeal to let the family know if the student's eligibility was changed. And we would let you know if it didn't change as well. Just kind of as Donna said, we look for you. There's not really a deadline for when the appeal needs to be received or the estimated income worksheet needs to be completed. We'll continue to reevaluate awards as long as we have funding available. And so we ask that before completing the worksheet, the family has a pretty good idea of what their 2021 income will be. And that's because we may ask you to verify that income in the spring semester once you have your 2021 tax return completed. So it's okay to hold off. You can let us know that your income, you expect your income to be lower. We'll post the worksheet immediately. And then when you're ready, go ahead and complete it.
Great, thank you so much. Are there other things about income that people should be thinking about? Besides loss of income from wages, what other kinds of things do you want to call out to people?
Something that we see often is, especially for first-year students, is child support ending. If it ends when the student turns 18, typically that child support is considered untaxed income that's reported on the FAFSA. And then when the student turns 18, the family is no longer receiving that. So by the time that the student's going to school, that source of income is no longer there. For that type of income that's ended, we actually would just ask the family to share with us and document in writing the amount of child support that they expect to receive in 2021. They don't have to complete the estimated income worksheet unless other things had changed, and we'll just use that amount. So if it's a zero, then we would just ask you to document that child support ended in 2020. There's nothing being received in 2021.
So from a school perspective, because we're working with federal funds as well, this is considered reduction to child support or child support ending is considered an appeal. So the family would have to notify the schools, and the University of Vermont would require that as well, as to the change in the child support. And then we would ask for supporting documentation, and I'm sure schools would as well, to verify what the family was receiving in child support and what the new child support is.
Perfect. And I see on the slide, you also are talking about one-time income. Donna, can you start on that one and tell us kind of what happens with that?
Absolutely. So there are times when families, for different reasons, will have an income that they will not have in the future. That could be from a capital gain. It could be from a severance package. It could be an inheritance. Anything that would not be a standard part of the family's income from year to year. Again, that is considered an appeal for schools and for the University of Vermont. And this family would reach out to us and let us know that they did have a one-time income that was in their tax information. And we would ask for verification to support what the 2019 income was. So a copy of the 2019 tax return, and then look at what's reported on there, and then potentially remove that income from the adjusted gross income.
Miranda, anything different that you do at VSAC with those types of income?
Nothing really different. We would likely do the same thing, ask for a copy of the 2019 tax return and remove that one-time source. If other things had changed as well, we might ask for an estimated income worksheet, but we'll try to use the tax return.
Okay, so let's move on to medical expenses. I know at VSAC, we get a lot of questions from families that are facing high medical expenses. whether they have a parent or a child that's facing a medical procedure, whatever it might be, or a long-term illness. How is that appealable? First of all, is it reported on the FAFSA to begin with at all? And if not, can they still appeal it, and under what circumstances? And Donna, would you start on that?
Absolutely. So again, that is considered an appeal from a college, from an institutional perspective, and from UVM's perspective. It does not show up on the tax return. However, it is reported on Schedule A of the tax return if the family itemized their deductions and part of that itemization was medical expenses. So typically what colleges will do is ask for a copy of the Schedule A if the family filed one, to verify how much in medical expenses were paid out of pocket. It's important that the expenses, when they're submitted to us, were paid out of pocket, that they were already not paid for through a health savings plan or health savings account, because again, you've already had that benefit of receiving a break there. But we will look at those medical expenses, or some colleges will look at those medical expenses. And in our case at UVM, we'll take those medical expenses, we'll look at the amount that was reported on the Schedule A if they filed a Schedule A. We'll take a percentage from a formula called the needs analysis formula that's already appropriated for medical expenses, and we'll come up with a final number that we will use, and then we'll subtract that number from the adjusted gross income. Different schools will do very different things in the case of medical expenses. So it's just important, again, when you're reaching out to schools, especially if you're considering more than one institution, to find out how they will approach this situation. It's also important to note that throughout this process, there's going to be a lot of paperwork that might be required. If you didn't file a Schedule A, you might have to provide us with receipts of paid medical expenses. So again, keep those lines of communication open. The quickest way to getting your appeal resolved is to respond to any of these documents in a timely manner.
Donna, you've mentioned a couple of times paid medical expenses.
Yes.
So I'm assuming that the key word there is they have to be paid versus just incurred. You may owe a large amount to a hospital, but if you haven't actually paid them.
That is correct. That is correct. And, a lot of times the insurance companies will pay for a percentage of the medical expenses, and the difference of what they paid and what you have then paid out of pocket is what would be counted towards your expenses.
Okay.
Sure,
go ahead and speak to VSAC if you would.
For the Vermont grant, we're pretty similar. We are looking for the expenses to be paid. And we will, before the medical expenses have an impact on the family contribution, which then impacts the Vermont grant, the medical expenses need to be 5% or more of total income. And similar documentation for if the medical expenses were paid in 2019, we'll ask for Schedule A from the federal income tax return. And don't worry, if you didn't file the Schedule A, then we will ask for an itemized list of the expenses that you paid out of pocket. If you expect to pay a high amount of medical expenses in 2021, we want to use the same income that you are paying the medical expenses from. So we will ask you to complete a 2021 estimated income worksheet. And on that worksheet, there's a line where you can let us know how much medical expenses you expect to pay out of pocket in 2021. And the medical expenses, things that we can consider as a medical expense are insurance premiums, dental expenses, medical prescriptions, travel, if you needed to travel out of state for a procedure or stay, even out of state, unfortunately, for a procedure. Those are the types of expenses that we can consider. And we would have you, again, itemize that list for us.
Great. Thank you so much. All right, so let's move on to family size. And I have another example for you to reflect on and tell me what would happen in this situation. So the Smiths have two children. Their youngest son, Sam, just turned 18 and has been accepted to college and will be starting in the fall. They also have an adult daughter who is a single mom with a 1-year-old daughter of her own. The adult daughter is working at a local grocery store where she works an extended night shift. In early January of this year, their daughter moved home along with her child so that Mr. and Mrs. Smith could help her with childcare while she worked. The Smiths are happy to have their daughter home and their granddaughter, but they're finding it is much more expensive to have 5 of them at home rather than 3. Can they appeal their family size? And Donna, again, do you mind starting with that one?
Not at all. So the answer to that is yes. So, and I want to just point out again, and I probably have already done that, but I'm going to kind of keep doing it. An appeal typically is something that has changed since you filled out your initial FAFSA. So in this case, the daughter has moved back in with the parents after the FAFSA was completed. The answer is yes. The daughter and the grandchild can be counted in the family size if the family is providing at least half of their support. Now, that could get complicated. There could be, the dad or the father of the child maybe providing child support. It could be a considerable amount. Those are all things that we will look at, or that colleges will look at when determining whether or not they can be counted in the family size. But typically the guidance on the FAFSA is if you're providing more than 50% of support to that individual or individuals, then you can count them in the family size.
Miranda, what about at VSAC?
At VSAC, we will likely follow up for a little more information. We'll ask some of those questions that Donna was just mentioning on whether or not the parents feel that they're providing more than half support for the older daughter and her child, or one of them, maybe even. We do have a worksheet that gathers that information that we might follow up with you to complete. So going back to what we've been saying is, you don't know if the answer, or if you feel if you don't ask. So it's always worth sharing the information. Let us know your circumstance as much as you're willing, comfortable sharing. And just be prepared that we might ask follow-up questions, but that's really for us to understand your situation to make sure that we're able to change your word as much as we can.
Miranda, I'm not sure what's happening with your mic, but your voice is coming through pretty robotic and garbled. So I want to give you a chance to see if there's something we can do to fix that. I don't know if we can try plugging it back in. Okay, now I don't hear you at all, so that did not help. Miranda, remember you're sharing your screen, so we're going with you. The whole audience is going with you.
Anything?
Oh, that's actually better.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
How much of my last answer did you hear?
You know what? It would be great if you repeated that, because I think it was really hard to understand what you said.
Okay. So for VSAC, we may be able to consider the increase in family size. We just will follow up likely with a couple of questions, whether to understand a little bit more about the type of support that's being provided, and if it's more than 50% of the older daughter or her child's overall expenses. And what I wanted to point out was that you don't know the answer on whether or not you can, if it's something that we would be able to take into consideration if you don't ask. So it's okay to ask questions, and just know that we may follow up with other questions to make sure that we understand your situation, so we can make sure you're eligible for the most that you're eligible for.
Sure. So we have a question that came in from our audience. It says, when appealing my aid, will there be any platform for me to testify to other changes to income? And she describes them as intangible, or is it based pretty solidly on the tax return from 2020?
For VSAC, it would be 2021 income and what you would expect to report on your federal income tax return. But things like medical expenses that we talked about that may or may not show up on the tax return could be considered. Other things that, depending on the circumstance, we at VSAC have allowed as a special circumstances, potentially lawyer fees. We evaluate each appeal individually and the circumstances. So again, it's, let us know what else you're thinking of, provide it to us in writing, and then we can let you know if anything changes.
Yeah, so from a college perspective, because we're dealing with, again, potentially Title IV federal funds, we have to be a little more careful as to how we look at appeals. Income obviously can play a major role, and there are different components to what's going on sometimes with people's income that could make a difference. The medical, alimony, anything like that. Sometimes families will take money from their 401ks or their 403bs. Sometimes they're rolled over, sometimes they're not, and that's counted in the income. That could be one of those one-time incomes that a family has. So again, what I would do is reach out to the school, to the University of Vermont, and let the schools know what the circumstances are, and we'll look at it. We're going to try to do the best we can do. The schools will do the best they can do for you by looking at your circumstances within the regulations.
So Miranda, I think this one is to you. My husband, the primary earner in our household, became unemployed as of March 31st. So right now he's been unemployed for about a month. How do we estimate the 21 income when we don't know when he'll find his next job?
Good question. For that, I would recommend you wait, if you can, until more of the year has passed, maybe till June, and then you estimate, best case scenario, the amount of income from June through the end of the year that he might earn if employment became available. At VSAC, as I mentioned, we will consider appeals as long as funding is available, and in years past, that funding is available at least through the fall semester. So obviously, the sooner you know, the better, and the sooner you're able to complete the worksheet, the sooner you'll know if it changes the grant eligibility. But we really do want you providing the best estimate that you can.
If you don't mind, I can add to that a
Absolutely,
little
Don.
bit.
I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
So from a school perspective, again, schools are going to be able to do different things. What I can tell you we do at the University of Vermont is if a family calls and they tell us that their 2021 income has been impacted, then what we have created is an estimated income worksheet from January 1st, 2021 through June 30th, 2021, and then July 1st, 2021 through December 31st, 2021. And at this point in time, if they were submitting that appeal, they've got a pretty good idea of what they know their first, 3 months of income already are. So they'd be estimating the last 3 months, or the last 3 months of the first half of the year, and then estimating the remaining 6 months. At that point in time, we do ask the families to wait until July to complete the worksheet and then submit it to us at that point in time. We'll reevaluate the aid if there's a change, and then the aid, any new appeal aid, would be retroactive to the fall semester if it takes longer than that.
Right. So Don, I want to make sure I understand
Yes.
that answer. So
Yes.
they could fill out the worksheet that was good from January to June now, and then wait till July to fill out the July through December?
No,
Or
it's,
you want them to wait till July for either of them?
yeah, it's one worksheet. And on the worksheet, it's broken down into two sections.
Okay, thank you.
So
Sorry.
for the most part, they're going to wait until July to fill it out and submit it to us. There are families that probably just started a brand new job on January 1st. They know exact, and it's less than it was in 2019, and it's less than it was in 2020, their income. But they know what their income is now going to be for the full year. So in those cases, we will use their projected 2021 income, and we'll have them submit that to us right away.
The last thing that I'll point out on that is you can, at VSAC, you can appeal more than once. So, if you complete the estimated income worksheet and things don't go well, or more things change, you can complete it again. Just get in touch with us and let us know.
Great, Marcia. Miranda, that's a really important distinction, that you can come back and do this again. So in this case, if this person filled out their appeal in June, and they had been unemployed for March, April, and May, and thought they were going to be working, but it didn't work out, they could come back to you in September and say, we're still unemployed.
Right.
Okay, perfect. So I know there's other information that you guys wanted to get to tonight. So I'm going to stop with questions for now and let you move forward.
Actually, it's a perfect segue. Oh, sorry. Yes, other types of appeals. So we know we have some things that we would talk about, but if there's any other questions out there, we could answer those first.
So one of the questions is, if a family's so if a family has something happen that costs them money, it doesn't change their income, but maybe they're like back when we had Irene, when Hurricane Irene went through, and a number of families lost their driveways and had to put new driveways in. We had a family who had a bridge that was the way they connected their home to the main road. It washed out. It had to be replaced. Can expenses like that be considered an appeal?
Yes. Again, depending on what the expense is, but absolutely those types, and we would be looking for what you had to pay if it happened in 2019, kind of similar to the medical expenses. What did you have to fix? What did you have to pay out of pocket in that year? Or if it happens this year, if it happened in 2021, let us know again what happened and how much you expect to pay out of pocket. We would probably have you do that estimated income worksheet for VSAC.
Donna, what about at the schools?
Yeah. The schools also have the ability to take those types of things into consideration. And I know in the past, when we've had these severe storms, hurricanes, we've had families reach out to us, letting us know what's happened and what the expenses were that they incurred as a result of it. And we have, in some instances, looked at things like that after the insurance, if there was any insurance, paid those expenses. So again, it's like anything else. If there's something that you are that is contributing to your financial stress or your inability to potentially fund your students' education, reach out to the colleges. Let them know what's going on. Reach out to UVM if the student is attending UVM. Let us know what's going on, and we will let you know what we can do and what type of documentation we will need to process that appeal.
Great, thank you.
Another example of an appeal that VSAC receives is sometimes when, for students who are under the age of 24, typically parent information is required on the FAFSA and on the Vermont grant application. But sometimes there are parents that there are extenuating circumstances about why a parent's information could not be reported. That's another type of appeal. That's usually only done in extreme circumstances, but there's documentation that we look for and supporting documentation from a third party. And I know for federal financial aid and through the colleges, there's a very specific process that students in that situation would need to follow.
Perfect, thank you. Dawn, is there anything else you want to add on?
Yeah, I think what we're speaking to in this instance is what we call a dependency override. So a student is considered dependent for financial aid purposes. However, the student hasn't had any relationship with their parents due to abuse, incarceration, things like that. And they have no parental information to provide. So we would ask for supporting documentation from third parties, speaking to what the issue is, what's happened in the family circumstances, and then potentially make that decision to override their dependency status and make them independent for financial aid purposes. Colleges do have the ability to do that. It may or may not benefit the student by doing that because there may not be that much additional aid, with the exception of maybe a federal Pell Grant or SEOG grant. So again, it's a matter of the student, the family presenting the information to us. We'll look at it and evaluate as to whether or not it's going to help the student. But a dependency override, once the student is made independent for financial aid purposes, they will remain independent for financial aid purposes via a dependency override. So it's not a pick and choose.
Got it. Okay, thank you so much. Miranda, is there, what's our next slide about?
We are going to talk about how to appeal. So we touched on this a little bit earlier. If so we've talked about a whole bunch of different circumstances that you might want to appeal if you fall into any of them. And it's just important to know that documentation will likely be required. So usually start with a phone call though, or an email, just so you can kind of get an idea of what that documentation might be. Or even if it, if your circumstance is something that we can take into consideration, or something that would change your eligibility. Sometimes over the phone, you can tell us, not necessarily with income, but you could tell us that your child support ended, and we could run the calculation for you over the phone and let you know if that is something that would make enough of a difference to change the student's eligibility. We would still require that you send us something in writing, but we can at least estimate something for you. Sometimes it may be something that, it's not something that we're able to take into consideration. And that at least for VSAC, there's nothing more that you need to provide to us. You should still follow up with your schools. You want to send a separate letter to VSAC and your schools. It can be the same one unless you wanted to, make it really specific to, say, UVM, for example, and address them directly. But for VSAC, if you write a letter to the school and it provides the information, it's the document information that we can use, we'll accept that. And then start gathering the evidence of the information. So like the receipts that Donna was mentioning. Some of that takes some time. So, take that time, or make the list of the medical expenses, make a list of your changes so that you know what you want to include in that letter to VSAC and to the school.
Miranda, we just got a question. If someone has, how do you calculate the cost of travel for medical expenses? You had
So
mentioned that if somebody has a child that's being treated in Boston, that could be something that could be taken into account.
yes, there's I don't off the top of my head remember what it is, but there's a certain mileage allowance, like 50 cents a mile, that is allowed either, I don't remember if it's on a tax return or if it's just a general mileage allowance. We'll take that allowance multiplied by the mileage that you had to travel. So we'd ask you what that was, and use that along with if you had to stay in a hotel or rent a house or anything like that. Those type of expenses are something that we could take into consideration.
Perfect. Donna, what about at UVM?
Yeah, from the University of Vermont, and I'm sure any other schools that are working appeals in this specific type of appeal, we would do pretty much the same thing. We would ask the family to document their mileage, document any information related to having to stay overnight, hotels, things like that, even lunches, meals, dinners if necessary. And again, we'll look at it, we'll see what we can do within the regulations, and go from there.
Perfect. Thank you. So which of you was going to speak to what to include in your appeal?
I can do that. So basically, when you're writing an appeal, so from a UVM perspective, and I'm going to assume from most school perspectives, it probably makes sense to give us a call and let us know that you think you have something that's going on in your financial circumstances that we might be able to look at. And our advice, we'll talk a little bit about what that is, and we'll make we can pretty much come up with a rough idea as to whether or not that's going to be what we call a valid appeal or not. When you fill out I'm going to back up a little bit. When you fill out the FAFSA, a family contribution is calculated. If your family contribution is already at 0, there is no appeal. You're already going to receive the maximum amount of financial aid that you can receive from your institution, unless they have some of their own funds that they can award the student. But for the most part, most appeals, there's not anything else that can be done if the family contribution is 0. 0 is 0. So if we think that the family contribution is not a 0, and that what the family is telling us warrants us to look at things, then we would ask the family to send us an email, tell us what's going on, but not include any documentation at that point in time. Give us as much information as possible without giving us any documentation, supporting documentation. The appeal will be assigned from UVM's perspective to an email, to a appeals counselor, and that counselor will then work with the family regarding the appeals. So in your letter, you're going to summarize your special circumstances. You want to be specific. My 2020 income was less than my 2019 income. I lost my child support. I paid $20,000 out in medical or dental expenses. So as many specifics as you can give the school and the University of Vermont would be very helpful in this process. Once we get all of that information, typically the school will then follow up and say, okay, now we need the supporting documentation. And that could be any number of documents. It could be a document to verify the family size and the number of people in college. It could be tax returns. It could be estimated income worksheets. It could be Schedule A of the tax return. So a lot of different transactions and requests are being made during this process. But initially, kind of keep your appeal request short. Try to give us as much information without giving us too much, but if you give us too much, that's okay as well. And then we will go from there.
Another question just came in for both of you. What is the timing for the school's financial aid office and VSAC to respond to a written appeal? Are they waiting a week or two? Are they waiting a month? What will it take?
The time of the year has a whole lot to do with the turnaround time. So families that are just submitting appeals right now, I mean, we could be talking several weeks before we're able to get to that appeal, because we've had families who've submitted appeals to us in December and January. So it's important, the sooner you know that there's something different going on, to get that letter to us and get that appeal process started. Typically, probably in the next month and a half, as appeals start coming in, UVM may be able to turn that appeal around in 3 to 4 weeks, because part of that process is sending documentation to the federal processor and getting that documentation back before we can take the next step. So there's quite a bit involved as far as transactions and reporting information to the federal processor and getting that back. So again, all I can stress is just do it. Send the information to us as soon as possible, your request, and then we'll go from there.
Thank you, Donna. Miranda, what about VSAC?
At VSAC, we try to stick to about a 10 to 15 business day turnaround, so about 2 to 3 weeks. Last year, as Marilyn mentioned, we received a record number of appeals, so we did fall outside of that a little bit, but we do try to rearrange things to make sure that we can get those decisions out as soon as possible, especially as we get closer to the start of the school year. We know that bills are due, and not that the grant is dispersed by the start of school, but it's still helpful to know the amount that you will have coming.
Okay, so here's another question. This is another really interesting question. With the May 1st candidate reply date quickly approaching, should prospective students be communicating with the admissions office or financial aid office? So if they know they're appealing their financial aid and they haven't heard back yet, who should they be talking to? And if they're sending in information, where should it be sent?
So my recommendation would be that the first thing they do is contact the financial aid office to see where we are in the process. We should be able to tell the student, how long we're looking at before that appeal can be processed. If it's going to take them past that May 1st deadline and they're seriously considering attending UVM but still haven't made up their mind, they should contact the admissions office and see what their options are. Potentially putting a delay on the payment that's due on May 1st. Now, again, different schools will do different things. So it's really important to keep that in mind. At this point, we are very close to the May 1st deadline. So chances are, unless you receive your award in the next day or two, you're not going to have it before May 1st, at least from our perspective at UVM. So it would be to your best benefit to reach out to admissions and ask them if they can delay your admissions deposit or your admissions payment.
Yeah, and that sounds right, Donna. And as the expert from the schools, I think that's the answer that we need. So were there anything else that Donna, you Miranda, wanted to be sure we touched on tonight?
It's not really related to an appeal, but another question that we get often as families are trying to plan for future years is if families need to apply for financial aid every year, and the answer is yes. So because circumstances change. So this year you included your 2019 income. For next year, for the 22-23 year financial aid, you'll use your 2020 income. So just know that each year is a new year to apply for financial aid.
Right.
And I just got one new appeal that I think we've seen this at VSAC, but I will give it to both of you. So this family, the mom and the children are living in Vermont. Dad has had to leave the state to find work. So he is renting an apartment that's not far from his new place of employment. So they're actually supporting two different households. So they're, again, another one of those cases, their income hasn't gone down, but their expenses have gone up. Is that something we can take into consideration?
Again, that would be considered a potential appeal. I can't speak to the other colleges. Again, that I would recommend reaching out to them. But I do know from the University of Vermont's perspective, we have looked at circumstances like that, where it's not a choice. The dad or the parent did not decide they just wanted to move out of town and work. They really had to. They were transferred or they had to find another position. We will take into consideration their potential expenses, ask for receipts, rent, utilities, things like that, and make a determination based on those things.
Right, because the needs analysis that you're talking about assumes that the family's all living in one household and have a certain set of expenses
That's correct.
that are obviously in this case would just be doubled.
Right.
Miranda, what about at VSAC?
Same at VSAC, we'd ask for the documentation of the expenses, estimated for if he's expected to be there for the whole year or for the next 6 months. And then we would take that into consideration against the income.
Great, thank you so much. So I think at this point we are 5 minutes away from the end of our evening together. I do want to give the audience the information on how to reach out to us. If you do need to appeal your Vermont State grant, you can email us at grants@vsac.org. You also are welcome to reach out directly to Miranda if you would like. And we have a toll-free number to call and get information. For those of you interested at the University of Vermont, Donna's email address, as well as UVM's financial aid office email address, is on the screen, and a phone number that will get you right to the financial aid office. We are going to send out a copy of this presentation to everyone who registered tonight, so you will be able to have that contact information. And the last thing that I'll mention is that VSAC does have a number of financial aid videos that are available. They are at the link that we're showing on the screen right now. So by all means, don't hesitate. You've heard Donna and Miranda say any number of times tonight, please reach out to us, call us, email us, reach out to your schools, reach out to VSAC, and they're waiting for you to do that. They won't know you need them until you reach out to them. But that's what they're there for, is to make sure that families have the financial aid that they need to attend college. So don't hesitate to reach out. And we have one last poll question up right now. So if folks would just take a moment to answer that before we end the presentation tonight, that would be great. Donna, do you have any other closing remarks you'd like to make?
Yeah, so basically what I wanted to say is I know sometimes when you're sharing information regarding your special circumstances, you're sharing a lot of personal information, and sometimes it can be very difficult to share. It's uncomfortable. And I just want you to know that financial aid administrators, I'm sure the people at VSAC, are all keep all of this information confidential first and foremost, and are very good at understanding and working with the families throughout these difficult times. So I just want to put that out there because I know a lot of this is very private, and it can bring up some unfortunate emotions during some of this process. So I just want to put that out there.
Thank you, Donna. Miranda, what about you? Any closing comments?
No, just, I'll say it again, you don't know if you don't ask. The worst we can say is no, and unfortunately, sometimes we do have to say no. But get in touch. Let us know if things have changed.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for joining us this evening. We will be doing another VSAC Shows You How at some point in the future, probably in the next month or so. And we will reach out and let you know what the topic is going to be and the date of our next presentation. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
And Donna and Miranda, thank you. You guys were excellent, and it was really wonderful to have your expertise be part of this conversation.
My pleasure.
Thank you.